Thank you very much. Well, I was about your age, a little bit younger, not that old, when this race was on. The race I'm going to talk to you about today. It was the men's 100-meter final at the 1988 Olympic Games in Seoul, South Korea. And it left a very deep impression on me. That must be obvious by the fact that here I am, 24 years on, still talking about it, and I've managed to spin a 9.79 second race into a 300-page book, which took some doing, I can tell you, or not. The race, the dilemma I had in sort of coming up with the title was whether to call it the dirtiest race in history or the greatest race in history. The reasons for both should become clear. What it certainly was a race that changed sport, changed the way we watch sport, and changed in particular the way we watch the men's 100-meter final at the Olympics. I was fortunate enough this year to be at the London Olympic Games and to be in the stadium on the night of the men's 100 metres. And the atmosphere at that event is extraordinary. Difficult to describe. It's the silence that can only be created by 80,000 people. The noise of anticipation. It was really charged, electric. A cliche though it sounds, it was an electric atmosphere. And you're scared to blink, you're scared to take your eyes away from the action for 1 second, not just the race itself, but the build-up, the Usain Bolt routine and everything. It all feels very significant. It's an amplified moments, and the race itself is almost like a slow-motion explosion. Absolutely compelling stuff. I mean, the 100 metres is a special event, the shortest on the Olympic programme, and it's remarkable for its brevity. And you'll all, I'm sure, have watched and enjoyed the London Olympic Games this year, and so you'll be more than aware of how the world is captivated and held spellbound for the 2 weeks while the Games are on. And so it was in 1988 when the Games were held in Seoul. And yet those Games were overwhelmingly about one event and two men, two Usain Bolts. The first was Carl Lewis. Carl Lewis was a little bit different. He wasn't your typical athlete. In 1984 at the Los Angeles Olympics, he won 4 gold medals, which is basically Usain Bolt plus the long jump. He was the first man to do so since the great Jesse Owens in 1936. And he transcended sport. He was a style icon, a little bit like David Beckham. He was more than just a sportsman. But as a runner, he was truly extraordinary. Elegant, graceful, beautiful, fluid style. And a runner who male sports writers were unusually and unashamedly keen to describe as beautiful. He was a beautiful runner. And he was peerless in '84. But over the next couple of years, a rival emerged. Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson was everything that Carl Lewis was not. He was his polar opposite. Whereas Lewis was smooth, Johnson was rough. Lewis was a middle-class American. He was educated and eloquent. Johnson was a poor immigrant from Jamaica who grew up in his teens in Canada. He was afflicted by a terrible stutter. He spoke with a very strong Jamaican accent. He was bullied at school, and he was the butt of jokes in his training group when he began to sprint. And in style, too, these two were complete opposites in the way that they ran. Johnson was famous for his explosive start. He would burst out the blocks, race into a big lead, whereas Lewis was a bit taller. He would take longer to unfold, and he would carry on accelerating up to 50, 60 meters. And so in every possible way, they were opposites. If you were to invent a fictional rivalry, you couldn't have two better characters. Johnson began to beat Lewis quite regularly in the years after LA, 85, 86. And by 87, he was beating him all the time. And Lewis hated this. Lewis hated not being number one, and he hated Johnson. And Johnson hated Lewis. So again, the perfect ingredients for a compelling sporting rivalry. Before Seoul, they had a major meeting at the World Championships in Rome. This was the big head-to-head before their expected showdown at the Olympic Games. And Johnson there just confirmed his superiority. He blasted into the lead as he tended to do. Lewis slowly pulled him back but couldn't quite get there. And Johnson won in a new world record of 9.83 seconds, which took a tenth of a second off the old time. It was extraordinary. Here were the two fastest men in history. As I said earlier, they were two Usain Bolts. We were very privileged at the time to have them. There were 12 months to go now till Seoul, and the big one at the Olympic Games, the race that everybody was talking about and excited about. But over the next few months, the balance tilted back towards Lewis. Johnson was injured. He fell out with his coach. He disappeared to the Caribbean island of St. Kitts, stopped training. Lewis, meanwhile, I think liberated by the absence of his rival, began to run with that same relaxed ease that he'd had in '84. And he was running better, in fact, than he had been in '84. But come Seoul itself, Johnson had recovered. He was running well again. Lewis was running well. The two of them, the two fastest men in history, were at the very top of their game. And for the race itself, it was, if you can imagine, 10 times bigger than this year's 100 meters, where there was one major attraction, Usain Bolt. This race was the race that everybody was talking about. It's the race the world was watching. It was so hyped, so anticipated, and yet it did a very unusual thing for a race that's so hyped. It actually exceeded expectations. What's remarkable about it is Lewis's body language. If you watch a clip of him in '84, he was completely in his own world. He focused on his lane, relaxed. Here, even before they start, as they got into the blocks, he glanced across at Johnson. And in the race itself, he glanced across twice more in the first 20 meters, something that infuriated his coach. And then again, in the final 20 meters, he looked across twice more at Johnson. We can see him looking there at Johnson. Even in the final 10 meters, he began to drift as though pulled by a magnet towards Johnson. It was remarkable to watch how the rivalry impacted on him in particular. After the race, Johnson did a lap of honor, and then he was pulled in for an interview. And he was asked which he treasured more, the world record or the gold medal. The gold medal, he said, because they can't take that away from you. Only they could, and they did. I remember 2 days later, on a family holiday, watching the Olympics Day, the nightly BBC programme with the highlights of that day's sport in the Olympic Games. And as we were watching, Des Lynam, who was the presenter of the programme, was handed a sheet of paper, a sheet of yellow paper, I remember. And as he began to read, the colour drained from his face. He said, "I've just been handed a sheet of paper. And if what it says is true, then it'll be the most dramatic story of these Olympic Games or any other Olympic Games. It says that Ben Johnson has tested positive for anabolic steroids." It was as though a bomb had gone off. This had never happened before. Drugs in sport had been rumoured and whispered about. The previous year at the World Championships, in fact, Lewis had made some pointed comments about there being a strange air at the championship, that some of the runners winning medals were on drugs. But he said that the day after he was beaten by Johnson, and most interpreted it as sour grapes. But this was huge. This was extraordinary. Not only had a major athlete been caught, but the biggest athlete had been caught, the biggest fish of all. And like I say, it was like a bomb going off. Johnson was disgraced. He was vilified. He was smuggled out of the country, bundled back home to Canada, where he was greeted with headlines such as, "Thanks, Ben, you bastard," said the Ottawa Citizen. That was typical. He began to be described as not Canadian anymore, but Jamaican-born Canadian. There was just absolute hostility towards him. But watching all this, and watching his treatment, and this sense that he was almost being treated like a murderer, I felt a curious kind of sympathy or fear for Johnson. I felt that there was more to this story than met the eye, that this fairly inarticulate man from Canada couldn't have been solely responsible for the greatest scandal, the biggest disgrace in Olympic history. So it proved. I didn't know at the time, however, that Johnson had been using steroids for 7 years. But I also didn't know that 6 of the 8 finalists would at some point in their careers test positive or be involved in some kind of drug scandal. I didn't know that Carl Lewis, none of us knew that Carl Lewis had tested positive at the US Olympic trials before those Seoul Games for stimulants, and had he been sanctioned, as the director of the lab that found him positive suggested he should be, then he wouldn't have been competing in Seoul at all. That news only emerged in 2003. I also didn't know, none of us knew, that 4 years earlier at the LA Games, on the final weekend, the lab director, who I went to interview for the book, found 9 positive tests. He handed the paperwork over to the International Olympic Committee, head of the medical commission, who took it back to his hotel, put it in a safe, and the next morning discovered that the safe had vanished. So there were things going on. There was certainly corruption at the highest level of sport at that time. Some of this would only emerge much later on. And I didn't know also that as Johnson sat in the anti-doping room waiting for his bladder to fill to give a urine sample after that race, that he sat beside a mystery man. Now this man, Andre Jackson, happened to be a friend of Carl Lewis. He was staying with Carl Lewis in a house in Seoul. He wasn't accredited. He shouldn't have been in the anti-doping room. And there's always been this mystery about what exactly he was doing there. Johnson claims now that he spiked his drink. I tracked him down. He lives now in Angola, where he runs a diamond mine. And I asked him, I said, you could set the record straight. Ben Johnson says you spiked his drink. You could tell me whether or not this is true. And he said, very cryptically, of course I can say I did. I can say I didn't too. What's the difference? So the mystery endures around this race. It's a mystery that has fascinated me, as I said at the start, for 24 years, and it's why I turned my attention to the book, during which I interviewed both Ben Johnson, who still feels like a victim. He's still very haunted by this event. It defines his life. He is still regularly described as the biggest drugs cheat in history. I also met Carl Lewis, who is as charismatic now as he was then, and Carl Lewis is hailed and widely acclaimed as the greatest Olympian of all time, with 9 Olympic gold medals. What interested me about Lewis was that he still thrives on the sense of a rivalry. His rival now is no longer Ben Johnson, but Usain Bolt. And if any of you follow the press, he takes every opportunity he can to criticize Bolt publicly. But one thing, as I said at the start, this is the sport, this is the race that changed sport. We were never able again to watch the 100 meters in particular with that same enjoyment and innocence that we had in '88, when we thought we were watching the 2 fastest men in history. It spoiled the race. The legacy of that race is that now, where there was once innocence, there's now cynicism, skepticism, suspicion around that event in particular, and outstanding performances in general. But one thing has changed just very recently, just in the last few weeks, in fact. Ben Johnson is no longer the most disgraced, the biggest disgrace in the history of sport, the most reviled drugs cheat in the history of sport. That dishonor now falls to Lance Armstrong. Thank you very much.